Okay. I'd like to supplement Joseph's excellent survey of this year's cases with putting with some longer-term perspective on the Second Amendment doctrine or history as it's developed. The first time I attended the gun rights policy conference was in 1988. Let's think about the situation back then. In our nation's capital, it was illegal to own a handgun. If you owned a long gun in your home, it was illegal to use that gun for self-defense of yourself or your family in your own home. And of course, it was impossible for an ordinary citizen to lawfully carry any type of firearm for protection in the capital of our nation. In Chicago and 6 Chicago suburbs, the situation was similar. Chicago had banned handguns in 1981. 6 other suburbs in Chicagoland did the same. It was impossible to get a carry permit anywhere in the state of Illinois. There was not even a procedure to apply. And as we pointed out in an amicus brief in the McDonald case, Chicago's handgun ban was followed very swiftly by Chicago becoming one of the most dangerous cities in the United States, as Washington, D.C. Had already become the murder capital, but Chicago fought pretty hard for that title as well. And as the details, the statistics showed, it was highly unlikely that Chicago's sudden and precipitous increase in violent crime at the time of their handgun ban was purely coincidental. But things were even worse in Chicago in some ways because under policies that had been encouraged by the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development, housing authorities in Chicago and other places were making part of their lease conditions that tenants could not possess firearms. And in Chicago, they started something called Operation Clean Sweep, where they would do home-to-home searches of people's apartments looking for guns. They were conducted by searching the entire apartment units, including closets, drawers, refrigerators, cabinets, and personal effects. Now, that was finally put to an end by a 1994 lawsuit, but the problem of gun bans in public housing was pervasive. It was encouraged by the federal government and deprived some of the poorest and most vulnerable citizens of their rights to self-defense. And the purported justification for the searches was, oh, these are exigent circumstances, which do sometimes allow warrantless searches. But as the federal district court found, not one of these searches actually met the exigent searches circumstance. They weren't even conducted within, say, 48 hours of a recent shooting in the area. So one of the biggest effects of the win in the Heller and McDonald cases has been the continuing removal of these gun bans in public housing. Those are people who have benefited immensely from the Heller decision because they now have the right to keep arms in their home for lawful protection. San Francisco was one of the first to comply under the threat of a potential lawsuit in 2008, and most other public housing authorities have eventually come into compliance with the Constitution, and those that don't have been successfully sued. Most recently, the East St. Louis Housing Authority, which lost a case earlier this year. Another dramatic change that's happened as a result of the Heller and McDonald has been the end of laws which were enacted in many states that had prohibited legal resident aliens either from possessing handguns or carrying handguns or even applying for a carry permit. And from Honolulu to Massachusetts, those laws, many of which trace back to xenophobic attitudes from the 1920s, they have been eradicated. So the Second Amendment is not just something that's for people of above a certain income level or race or color or background. It's for everybody, and the everybody here who's helped participate in the Second Amendment movement should be proud of how this movement has done so much to help the self-defense rights of our new lawful immigrants and of people in public housing. Now, yeah, give yourselves a round of applause. One of the, as Heller's ramifications began to be considered, there was, and still is, lots of massive resistance, as the Southern segregationists called their program in the 1950s. There's been plenty of massive resistance in certain quarters to Second Amendment civil rights, in Chicago and that area being a particular problem. Chicago and one of its suburbs attempted to ban all gun stores in the area, which is obviously, one would think, a Second Amendment violation. They lost those cases in federal district court and did not attempt to appeal that. But on the other hand, the Ninth Circuit upheld the policy of Alameda County, California, a suburb on the East Bay, or of county on the East Bay, whose zoning laws made it unlawful for any new gun store to operate to open up anywhere in the county. And the Ninth Circuit, a three-judge panel, said this seems like this could be a Second Amendment violation and sent it back to the district court for consideration under the strict scrutiny standard. But as apparently the rule in the Ninth Circuit, any decision that favors the Second Amendment will be overturned by an en banc panel, which is what happened in the Ninth Circuit. And the Ninth Circuit majority said, we don't even really see a Second Amendment issue here, because unless you show us somebody who can't buy a gun, then there's no Second Amendment issue at all. Sort of like somebody that says, well, it's okay to ban all new bookstores in an area because whatever, people can buy a book at a different store. They can buy it on Amazon. Bookstores, there's no intrinsic right for bookstores to exist under the Ninth Circuit's theory. Likewise, shooting ranges have been an active area of Second Amendment litigation, and with the Second Amendment Foundation very heavily involved in the Ezell 1 and Ezell 2 cases, where Chicago outlawed all shooting ranges open to the public within city limits. And then after they lost that case, they said, fine, we will change our zoning laws, and we will now allow shooting ranges to exist in theory at least, on 2% of the city of Chicago. And the court in the Seventh Circuit in the Ezell 2 case said, no, you can't do that. That's absurdly restrictive. And likewise, the court struck down Chicago's ban, which prohibited anyone from under the age of 18 from even entering a lawful shooting range to learn safety. Yeah. Thank you. Ms. Ezell right there, thank you. How much time? Okay. The question that we continue to face is the same one that was raised by Frederick Douglass in a speech he gave in New York City in 1865 as the Civil War was coming to an end, and it was clear that slavery in a formal sense was going to be abolished. But he asked the question, in what new skin will the old snake come forth? And he accurately predicted that some of the former slave states would attempt to keep some of the former slaves in a condition of de facto servitude and bondage, even while not legally calling it slavery. And he predicted that the aggressive gun control program that had been aimed at black people in the South would be continued and expanded. And he urged congressional action to prevent that, and said until that was done, the work of the abolitionists will not be finished. Eventually, Congress did that with the Second Freedmen's Bureau Bill, the Civil Rights Act, and then finally the 14th Amendment. But still, that work is not finished because there are continuing massive violations of civil rights in this country, which are, in some places, being upheld. So the old snake of gun prohibition, of handgun prohibition, well, the California legislature realized they couldn't, at least until the Supreme Court gets flipped in a different direction. They couldn't ban all handguns, so they have instead banned all new handguns. And under a law that's supposedly about public safety called, it has been impossible now in California, illegal in California, to sell any firearm model that was introduced in 2013 or thereafter, because all such models have to double microstamp for a semi-automatic pistol, have to double microstamp the case in a manner that is factually impossible to comply with. Not even the guy who invented this supposed technology has ever been able to demonstrate that he, in his own lab, can operate microstamping at the level demanded by the state of California. So California has, in effect, banned all new semi-auto pistol models. That case is currently before the Supreme Court on a cert petition, and the court has conferenced on it, but is holding the case apparently till it resolves its current Second Amendment case, for which there will be oral argument on December 2nd. And as most of you know, that case is New York State Rifle and Pistol Association versus New York City. A New York City administrative regulation made it illegal for a licensed handgun owner in New York City, who's one of the most highly vetted populations in the country, to take their handgun out of the city ever, except they could take it hunting within New York State. And other than that, the handgun had to stay in the city. So if you were going on vacation and driving through Pennsylvania or all the way out here, where you could lawfully carry your gun for protection in most of those states, illegal to do so, illegal to take your handgun out of the city. If you had a second home in the Poconos or the Catskills, illegal to take your handgun from your home in your apartment in New York City to your second home someplace else, illegal to take it up to New Hampshire for safety training at one of the great schools, illegal if you live in Staten Island to just drive across the water and go shooting at a convenient target range in New York, in New Jersey. And the Second Circuit upheld it and said this probably isn't even a Second Amendment issue. So that instead of their former view that no individuals have Second Amendment rights, what the Second Circuit has in essence done is saying, all right, individuals do have Second Amendment rights, but other than a complete ban on handguns in the home, nothing could ever violate that right. They didn't say that so expressly, but if you add up the conglomeration of doctrines they've created, that's the meaning of those. As you also probably heard, New York City has attempted to moot the case, and mootness doctrine is complicated, but it looks like the fact that the court has scheduled oral argument suggests that attempt will not be successful. And then another time the old snake is still coming back is in a case for which I filed and with Joseph and the Cato Institute and a bunch of law professors and the Independence Institute where I work, filed a cert petition in Remington versus Soto. And that is a case where a 4-3 majority of the Connecticut Supreme Court said that Remington could be held liable for the Newtown murders because a Remington rifle was used in the crime. And of course, that kind of liability is something that was expressly outlawed by the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act from enacted by Congress in 2005, but the Connecticut Supreme Court fabricated a loophole in the law which no other court anywhere, even the Second and Ninth Circuits, have been willing to fabricate. And it's the same old snake, although in different contexts, because this is the same issue that the Supreme Court faced in the mid-1960s when it changed the libel law for tort in the case of New York Times versus Sullivan, because the court was well aware that there was a conspiracy to destroy the freedom of the press in the South by the abusive use of tort libel suits against the media, not only against the New York Times, but against CBS, the Saturday Evening Post, continuing bad practices, abusive suits that had first begun to be used in the South against the black press decades before. And the Congress acted to stop this kind of civil abuse in 2005, but the Connecticut Supreme Court is trying to start it up again. So the battle continues, but we're on the right side, and the snakes are not, so please keep up your activism. Thank you.